In other words, these post-addict rats look cured. If they were at Narco and Lexington, they'd be discharged as having achieved maximum benefit of hospitalization. There's nothing more to cure in a rat. And they are cured except for two things. If you put them back in the, you might say that Lexington represents the home cage, a drug-free environment. Well, if you put them back to a drug-available environment, namely linear maze, if you wish, the mazes of Harlem, then they are not normal. Then you find that they're very nervous. They have a lot more wet dogs. And also, if you give them an opportunity to make a choice, they most certainly will relapse. Now, the next slide, this goes on and on. I cannot take the time to tell you all the details. I will just say that we attempted to extinguish this differential choice of post-addict rats for the drug, and all we succeeded in extinguishing was a mild aversion to the drug, which was very pronounced in the control rats, but developed in the post-addict rats as the testing went along, so that the final test that was done here, test relapse 8 at 140, can you focus that please, up here? Yeah. This is about 142 days after withdrawal of the drug. The differences became even more startling. The control rats took nothing, absolutely nothing of the drug, wouldn't drink anything. They drank all their fluids in these free choice tests in the form of water. But the post-addict rats drank actually more of the, well, I'm not sure about that, but they drank a great deal of the flavored drug. And this is 142 days after withdrawal. In fact, as you see here, compared with the control rats, there's an absolute preference in the sense that the post-addict rats drank more of the drug and less of water than the control rats. Now, I haven't thrown these rats out yet. We're testing them about once a month to see what happens, and the last test I made was 244 days after withdrawal of the drug, and they're still relapsing. The wet dog differences are less striking, but they still tend to come and go. Here you see 145 days absent. There's still a big difference in the linear maze, but not in the home cage. No difference in the home cage. But linear maze, yes. So how long this will go on, I still don't know. But 244 days, if you include the data not on this slide, is 8 months after withdrawal of the drug, and 8 months is a long time in the life of a rat. Now, just the next two slides, we'll may I have those two? These are statistical analyses. I can't bother to go through all of them, but I just want to say this is an analysis of variation, analysis of variance for the wet dog frequencies, and we had some significances on every single test, although all three possible significances were obtained only on one of the tests. But this is pretty good considering the crudity of the measures. The next slide is the Mann-Whitney U test of the relapses and the drinking choices. And you see the first four, the differences in the first four relapse tests. That goes up to about, I think, 55 days, something like that, are significant. And then after our extinction procedures, they again became significant. And the eighth relapse test, 142 days abstinent. Yeah, this was 58, yeah, 142 days abstinent. I think that's all the slides. If I may have the lights, I'll finish up the presentation. Now, so much for the experimental data. Though the data are consistent with the two-factor learning theory of relapse that I've promulgated, this conclusion must be a tentative one at present, because the experiments described have not ruled out with assurance the possibility that the differences between the experimental and control rats in the relapse tests were due to latent but long-enduring hyperirritability in the former, that is to say, in the post-addict rats, as a result of previous addiction to morphine, rather than to the putative interactions between morphine abstinence and the specified stimulus arrangements in the linear mazes during training. While the low frequencies of wet dogs in the home cage on the relapse tests would seem to rule out such a possibility, they were somewhat higher in the experimental than the control rats through the 72nd day of abstinence, as already noted, and in an earlier study, rats withdrawn from morphine at a final stabilization dose level of 360 milligrams per kilo per day showed small but consistent differences from control rats for 4 to 6 months. Conceivably, therefore, the duration of time over which relapse tests in the present study were made may not yet have been sufficient to reveal the effects of conditioning and reinforcement during training as such. These two interpretations that I've offered, namely residual hyperirritability persisting for unbelievably long times after withdrawal of morphine, and or combined with the conditioning processes that the experiment was designed to produce, these two interpretations are not merely academic, for they have a number of different consequences for further research and therapy in man. Thus, if the behavior of the post-addict rats compared with the control rats in the relapse tests was due only to residual hyperirritability, then the method of morphine withdrawal in the treatment of human addicts is not a crucial issue, provided it is sufficiently painless to ensure the addict's cooperation. Rather, the problem is to determine the exact physiological nature and the duration of such residual hyperirritability, and to devise methods of treatment to shorten or control it by pharmacological or other means. By use of the cold pressor test, Himmelsbach was able to show that the autonomic reactivity of post-addicts is slightly greater than normal for up to 6 months after withdrawal of morphine. It is conceivable that with more refined techniques, differences of this sort would be revealed for even longer periods. If such proves to be the case, currently prevailing methods of treatment, namely withdrawal of morphine by substitution and subsequent withdrawal of methadone, supervised abstention from drugs of all kinds in a drug-free environment for as long a period of time as practicable, combined with institutional and post-institutional psychotherapy and social rehabilitative measures, all these would need to be modified only in details, not in principle. If, on the other hand, the behavior of the post-addict rats relative to the controls in the relapse tests was due to the conditioning and reinforcing procedures employed during training, then the implications of the experimental results for the drug withdrawal phase of treatment in man are quite far-reaching, for methods would have to be devised for extinguishing conditioned abstinence and reinforced drug acquisitory behavior. This is not accomplished by passive withdrawal of and prolonged abstention from morphine in a drug-free environment, with or without nonspecific psychotherapy, any more than satiating a rat with food and keeping it away from the Skinner box for a period of time will cure it of its bar-pressing habit, which was previously reinforced by food rewards on the conditions of food deprivation. Rather, true extinction of both processes would require an attack on each separately in reverse order under very different conditions. Thus, extinction of morphine acquisitory behavior would require maintenance of the state of morphine deprivation, that is, prolongation of the abstinence syndrome by some means passively, coupled with non-reinforcement of instrumental activity directed toward acquisition of the drug, which of course is made to be unsuccessful. Practical realization of such an extinction procedure would depend on the development of at least 2 new drugs, namely one which, if substituted for morphine, would produce on abrupt withdrawal a prolonged, though not necessarily severe, abstinence syndrome, and another which, though not effective in suppressing abstinence phenomena produced by withdrawal of the first drug, would be sufficiently reinforcing on other grounds so that the addict would work for it on some schedule of reinforcement proven to be optimal by experiment. Of necessity, this phase of treatment would have to be carried out in an institution where, after its completion and withdrawal of the abstinence-maintaining drug, therapy could be directed toward elimination of the hypothetical residual hyperirritability discussed just before. Ideally, however, extinction of conditioned physical dependence should be carried out in the addict's natural drug-available environment so that he could be exposed to that conditioned stimulus and the secondary reinforcers, namely addict society, repeatedly, provided that the hoped-for extinction of drug acquisitory behavior previously carried out in the institution, coupled with close surveillance and, if necessary, appropriate non-narcotic pharmacological and psychotherapy, for suppression of conditioned abstinence and reduction of anxieties probably involving the same physiological stimulus, the same physiological system rather, is sufficiently effective to ensure against re-exposure to the unconditioned response, namely morphine abstinence phenomena generated by re-addiction. These speculations have been presented not for the purpose of recommending immediate changes in our treatment programs for addicts, but to illustrate how restatement of some mentalistic concepts about drug addiction and relapse in behavioristic terms may enable us to test their validity by experiment. Though, as stated, the role of conditioning factors in morphine addiction and relapse is not yet fully elucidated, the public operations by which they may be are quite readily discernible, and further research along the lines indicated may yet enable us to deal with these clinical problems more effectively than heretofore. Thank you.
Will Doctors Wickler and Friedman come to the front, please? Will you come? This is Wickler right here. And is Dr. Friedman here? Dr. Friedman?
Here he is.
Oh, yes. You're to face questions.
The only thing will be to
Repeat the question. Remind you to repeat the question.
because the cameras will remain focused on the panel and not the audience. And now, can you give me just 1 minute
Okay.
while I let them
Ladies and gentlemen, the next speaker, Dr. Isidore Chine, is professor of psychology at New York University. He also is well known to you for his extensive studies of the drug problem in New York. I take pleasure in presenting Dr. Chine.
Dr. Linda Smith, ladies and gentlemen. There are 4 interrelated premises on which public policy with respect to opiate addiction is based in the United States. 1, that the number of addicts is so overwhelmingly large as to gravely threaten the general social welfare. 2, that addiction is an extremely contagious disease. 3, that by far the most important task that needs to be carried out in the treatment of addicts is to get them to stop taking drugs. And 4, that given the fact of addiction, all other factors that distinguish one addict from another fade into insignificance. The last 2 of these premises are generally not made explicit, but their tacit assumption is as basic to American policy as are the first 2. The 4 premises and the policy based upon them make a fascinating exhibit because they are all wrong. That is, each of the premises is unsound, and the policy based upon them is utterly indefensible. These are, of course, fighting words in the climate of our times, so here's to the fray. The first of the premises, that the number of addicts is so overwhelmingly large as to gravely threaten the general social welfare, is set up on the basis of what I can only describe as a numbers game. Let me start with an anecdote that illustrates the crudest version of this game. My colleagues and I were known to be collecting data on drug use among juveniles in New York City. Shortly before a major hearing by a legislative committee on the narcotics problem in the city, we were visited by representatives of 3 agencies concerned with the problem. Each of our visitors explained that he would be called upon to testify and would surely be asked about the number of juvenile addicts in the city. Each further explained that he did not know the answer to this question and hoped we could tell him. We gave them our figures and the nature of our data, namely that we were working on only 3 of the 5 boroughs, that we were only dealing with detected cases, that we did not know the ratio of detected to undetected cases and hence did not know what multiplier should be used to estimate the total number, and that we did not know what proportion of our cases were already addicted. Within a few days, we read newspaper accounts of the testimony of each of our visitors. The distinction between a user and an addict was not mentioned. The 3 witnesses testified to widely different numbers of juvenile addicts, presumably based on arbitrarily chosen different multipliers, additions to include the 2 missing boroughs, and possibly a few added cases lest 2 rounded numbers might carry an aura of imprecision. None of the witnesses mentioned the common source or indicated the nature of the operations on the figures we had furnished. The smallest of the testified 2 numbers of juvenile addicts was, however, considerably larger than our total number of known drug-involved cases. The numbers game goes back a long time. In 1919, the Treasury Department reported that there were 1 million addicts in the United States, and other estimates were running as high as 5 million. Contrast these figures with the much more responsible estimate by Carl Ben-Dumetz of somewhat less than 215,000 at the beginning of the period 1915 to 1922, and of about 110,000 at the end of this period. I think that there is good reason to believe that even the Carl Ben-Dumetz estimates are exaggerated, in that they include many cases that were addicted in a very limited sense of the term. Bear in mind that the Harrison Act was passed in December 1914, and that its enforcement as a repressive measure began in 1919. There is no evidence of any extensive wave of violent reaction by the addicts to the withdrawal of their narcotic supplies. There does not seem to have been a tremendous wave of withdrawal sickness, nor any tremendous upsurge in the number of robberies of pharmacies and physicians' offices as desperate addicts attempted to replenish their supplies. Instead, the number of addicts was peacefully and quietly reduced to less than half the original number. Even if we were to assume that over the 7-year period, there was not a single new recruit to the ranks of the addicts, it seems clear that a large proportion of the original 215,000 could not have been very severely addicted. Let us turn to more contemporary versions of the numbers game. In 1958, Inspector Joseph L. Coyle, then in charge of the Narcotics Squad of the New York City Police Department, wrote that, quote, "From July 1st, 1952 to February 28, 1958, it shows that there are 22,909 drug addicts in the city of New York," end of quote. The "it" refers to a list compiled from all sources that could be tapped in addition to the police department's own files. From July 1st, 1952 to February 28, 1958 is clearly a time span, but the list shows that there are 22,909 addicts, that is, in the immediate present. Despite this curious construction of the statement, internal evidence that suggests the inclusion of non-using sellers, the absence of criteria of addiction, and the failure to provide any means of getting off the list, short of dying in New York City, despite these occasions for suspicion, 23,000 addicts became for a while the official statistic on the number of addicts in New York City. Some perspective on New York City's 23,000 addicts as of 1958 comes from my next source, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Beginning January 1st, 1953, the Federal Narcotics Bureau began on a national scale to emulate the New York City Police Department. There were two improvements in the federal procedure. Non-users were not included, and a means was provided for getting off the list. Specifically, a person not reported as a user for 5 years is transferred from the active to the inactive file. There's a curious gimmick in this procedure. A person transferred to the inactive file is counted as an active addict for the entire 5 years that he has not been known to be using drugs. What can we learn from the FNB statistics? In 1953 and 1954, there were 16,725 addicts reported. As of the end of 1959, 6 to 7 years later, there were 10,804 of these, or 65% of the original number, who were not again reported. That is, as far as anyone knows, 65% of the 16,725 addicts reported in 1953-54 were cured, dead, or had left the country by December 31st, 1959. At any rate, they were not known to have used drugs after getting on the list. For 1955, we do not know how many names were added to the list, but 7,234 of these cases were not heard from again as of the end of 1959. Even so, these 7,234 cases are included in the official count of 45,391 active addicts known to the Bureau as of the end of 1959. Even more interesting is the fact that more than 1/3 of these 7,234 cases had no known history of drug use prior to 1955. In other words, 2,473 cases were not known to be drug users either before or after 1955, but they are nevertheless counted as active addicts as of the end of 1959. One final bit of Bureau statistics. On September 19, 1962, the Commissioner of Narcotics was quoted in the press as having asserted that there are 46,798 addicts in the United States. When you compare this to the 45,391 of December 31st, 1959, you note an increase of only 1,407 cases in the almost 3 years that elapsed. And you may be inclined to breathe a sigh of relief at the declining rate. If so, that merely shows that you have not yet caught on to this particular game. To get from 45,391 to 46,798, you must first subtract from 45,391 the 7,234 non-recurring cases from the 1955 editions, and also the non-recurring cases from the 1956 and 1957 additions to the active file, to the remainder, which consists of the repeaters from prior to September 1957, and both the repeaters and non-repeaters of the last 3 or 4 months of 1957, and the repeaters and non-repeaters of 1958 and 1959. To this remainder, you add the entire whole of 1961 and 1962 cases up to September 1962. It will perhaps now be clear why I cannot take seriously the count of 46,798 addicts as of September 1962. My mind simply boggles at the thought of active addicts who no longer use drugs, and at the number of such addicts who are included in the 46,798. Of the latter number, the number of repeaters seems likely to come to considerably less, I repeat, considerably less, than 20,000 if the 1953-54 experience is at all dependable. That is less for the entire country than the official statistic I mentioned before for New York City alone. The 1955 data suggests that the proportion of non-repeaters is, if anything, increasing. If we were to assume that the total number of names added in 1955 equaled the average of the numbers added in 1953 and 1954, the percentage of non-recurrence would exceed 85 as compared to 65% for 1953-54. And there is reason to believe that the numbers added to the list would diminish from year to year during the early years of building the file, since the early years would have the advantage of listing cases already known from preceding years. Even among the 7,234 non-repeaters of the 1955 list, 9% gave a history of drug use of from 10 to 51 years. And please note that I have so far not even raised the question of whether being reported more than once in the course of several years as a regular user of narcotics is a sufficient basis for the diagnosis of addiction, to say nothing of the absence of criteria that form the basis of the designation regular use. The notion of tremendous hordes of addicts is, of course, by now so firmly entrenched that I am certain that many of you will start at this point to impugn the effectiveness of the Federal Narcotics Bureau and of all of the agencies cooperating with it in ferreting out cases. Let me therefore point out that while there are doubtless many instances of drug use that do not come to be known by any agency, the nature of the statistical bias is entirely in the direction of weeding out the least seriously involved cases. It is exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, for a seriously involved case to escape attention for very long. I have in the past offended the sensibilities of the Federal Narcotics Bureau by suggesting that they do not know how to count. I do, however, have the utmost faith and confidence in their capacity to carry out their primary job, the ferreting out of law-breaking. And every addict must be repeatedly involved in law-breaking. Moreover, in its list-building activity, the Bureau is assisted by its state and local counterparts, to say nothing of the public and private, medical and social agencies cooperating in this enterprise. The conclusion is inevitable. Not that there is no addiction to speak of, but that the number of addicts in any serious sense of the latter term must be far less than the official statistics would seem to indicate. There is a serious problem of addiction, but it is not nearly of the magnitude we have come to take for granted. Let me now turn to the second premise underlying public policy, the contagiousness of addiction. It is, of course, true that many a drug user was first initiated by an addict, and that there are addict pushers who try to recruit customers from the ranks of non-users. If this is to be interpreted as contagion, however, we must add that a basic condition of such contagiousness is the fact that the addict has no legitimate access to narcotics, to say nothing of legitimate access at a reasonable cost. The simple fact of the matter is that the spread of addiction is self-limiting. Let me remind you of the Kalb and Dumet's figures on the prevalence of addiction prior to the enforcement of the Harrison Act. That is, under the conditions of a completely open market, of the loading of proprietary medications with narcotics, and of far less caution in the prescription of narcotics by physician than prevails today. There were far fewer than 250,000 addicts in the country, and even this figure is achieved only by the inclusion of relatively minor degrees of involvement and the inclusion of cases that were addicted only in the sense of having developed some degree of physical dependence. We are in a position today to comprehend some of the reasons for the self-limiting spread. To begin with, normal people do not find the psychic effects of narcotics attractive. The obverse of the last statement is the admittedly not too compelling fact that when addicts come to psychiatric attention, they seem to be without exception diagnosable as suffering from one or another of a variety of mental disturbances, apart from their addiction. My colleagues and I, as well as other investigators, have found that the spread of drug use is associated with conditions of human misery. Drug use is, of course, a necessary condition of addiction, so that the epidemiological vectors of drug use may also be taken as relevant epidemiological vectors of addiction. We marked off on a map every census tract that had 3 or more cases of 16 through 19-year-old boys who were known to have been involved with narcotics in the period 1949 through 1952. We similarly marked off every tract with 1 or 2 cases if it was adjacent to a tract that had at least 3 cases. The result was a set of sizable islands, which we referred to as the epidemic areas. These epidemic areas, which collectively included 83% of the drug-involved late teenaged male youth, who were composed of only 15% of the census tracts in the 3 boroughs we studied, and included less than 2/5 of the late teenage male youth. When we compared the epidemic and non-epidemic areas with respect to virtually every undesirable characteristic we could think of, and on which we could get census tract data, the epidemic areas came out the worse off on 22 out of 24 indices. taking only the tracts in the epidemic areas and the immediately adjacent drug-free tracts. We calculated correlation coefficients between the various indices and the drug involvement rates. The multiple correlation came out to 0.86 for Manhattan, 0.83 for the Bronx, and 0.63 for Brooklyn. The lower correlation in Brooklyn is a function of the lower variability in drug rates. Poverty alone, indexed by the percentage of income units earning $2,000 or less, yielded correlations of 0.65, 0.66, and 0.43. As one approach to the investigation of the impact of such deprived environments on youth, we administered a questionnaire touching on a wide variety of issues to all 8th grade boys in 3 lower class, high delinquency neighborhoods that differed with respect to the rates of drug involvement of the youth. The returns were analyzed by means of a statistical technique that could identify clusters of items, the responses to which tend to hang together. One such cluster we identified as reflecting a delinquent orientation to life, a mood of pessimism, unhappiness, and futility on the one hand, and of mistrust, negativism, and defiance on the other. In the low and medium drug rate areas, certain attitudes favorable to drug use tended to go along with the delinquent orientation. This also happened in the high drug rate area, but in a much more complex fashion. In this neighborhood, which was by far the worst off of the 3 in terms of our indices of deprivation, the delinquent orientation could be seen to become differentiated into 2 related but nonetheless distinguishable strands. One emphasizing the mood of pessimism, unhappiness, and futility, and the other the mood of mistrust, negativism, and defiance. Both of these strands were associated with attitudes favorable to drug use, but there were important differences consistent with the emphasized mood. For instance, along with the version of the delinquent orientation that emphasized pessimism, unhappiness, and futility, there was a wholesale rejection of reasons for not taking heroin. There was no such tie-in with the other version of the delinquency orientation. Similarly, in our study of drug use in delinquent street gangs, it appeared that the threshold of maturity was a critical point. As the more normal youth became more and more occupied with relatively adult concerns, steady girlfriends and jobs, and the cohesiveness of the gangs was threatened, the already defeated youth turned to narcotics. And in a study of penitentiary inmates, one of my students, Stanley Schiff, obtained the following very interesting results. He compared 5 groups of inmates on an elaborate measure of self-esteem. An addict group still in their teens, a non-using group of teenagers, an adult addict group that started drug use while in the teens, an adult addict group that started drug use after they had passed their teens, and an adult non-using group. The 2 teenaged groups could not be distinguished from each other with regard to level of self-esteem, but both were higher than the late starting adult addicts and the non-using adults. Thus it appears that in this population, self-esteem declines with age. It is a population that is becoming more and more defeated. But what of the early starting adult addict group? Their level of self-esteem was just like the teenagers. It seems that they could preserve their self-esteem by taking on narcotics as an alibi for failure. Obviously, not all of the youth in the deprived areas turned to narcotics. By far, the worst record in any census tract was a 10% rate of involvement with narcotics among the late teenaged youth. What keeps the others away? One clue is provided by our study of 8th grade boys. The delinquent orientation and related attitudes are strongest in that segment of this population, which already has the most distinguished record of failure, the adjustment classes in the high drug use area. A second clue comes from our study of 4 groups of boys coming from similar neighborhoods: delinquents with no history of drug use, drug users with a prior history of delinquency, drug users with no prior history of delinquency, and boys who stayed clear of both narcotics and delinquency. The most important differences were between this group, this last group, and the others. These boys came from more cohesive families and were much more likely to have a father, a teacher, or a priest to whom they could talk about personal matters that bothered them. They also gave many signs of being able to perceive before them a meaningful and productive future, and of working toward the attainment of that future. Lastly, these boys gave many evidences of actively resisting the pull of their neighborhood environment. One would also expect that a major difference between those who give in to their degrading environment and those who resist it is to be found in the life history patterns that establish the personality organization. Psychiatric and clinical psychological studies have indicated the existence of severe personality disturbances among addicts. Certain characteristics seem to be most common. They are not capable of enduring intimate relations with others. They have difficulty in assuming their appropriate sex roles. They are frequently overcome by a sense of futility, expectation of failure, and general depression. They are easily frustrated and made anxious, and find frustration and anxiety intolerable. And in psychoanalytic terms, they suffer from weak egos and inadequately functioning superegos. It is not necessary, and indeed it would be false, to assume that such personality characteristics are unique to addicts. Note, however, how these personality characteristics fit in with the environmental and personal history vectors toward drug use that I have already described. In other words, if we look upon addiction as a form of behavior, addiction is no exception to the general rule that behavior is a function of person and environment. There is, however, a chicken and egg problem in connection with the studies of personalities of addicts. To what extent is the observed personality pattern a cause, and to what extent is it an effect of the addiction? To check on this issue, we proceeded as follows. We drew up a hypothetical picture of the kind of family life that would be expected to produce the kind of personality pattern described. We then set out to find whether this kind of family life is more characteristic of addicts than of non-delinquent, non-drug-using controls. In a word, it is. Much more important, however, is that we expected to find negative cases, addicts with a more normal family life, and controls with the kind of family life we had hypothesized for addicts. We wanted to study these negative cases intensively, but there weren't any negative cases. Such trivial overlap between the two groups as there was, and it was trivial, melted away when we turned from our indices to the case protocols. I have only touched upon the evidence that supports my proposition that drug use is a product of human misery. It should be clear, however, that any talk of addiction as contagious is profoundly misleading. The addict is a person with serious problems, and the spread of addiction reflects unsolved problems that are focused on limited segments of our society. Which brings me to the third of the premises that I am discussing, that by far the most important task that needs to be carried out in the treatment of addicts is to get them to stop taking drugs. In the light of what I have already said, this premise is a manifest absurdity. The important task is to help them to solve their problems, and that they take narcotics is per se the least of these. Add that narcotics do in many cases have an adaptive function, just as do the symptoms of psychoneurosis, and that eliminating recourse to such symptoms without producing any more fundamental change leaves the patient in dire peril indeed. Add that addicts have been known to lead useful and relatively productive lives despite their addiction. Finally, add that the worst consequences by far of addiction are entirely a result of our public policy with regard to addiction. With no access to quality-controlled drugs, the addict literally risks his life every time he takes a shot. He is compelled to move in criminal circles, giving up any normal associations he may have had. The jobs for which he is equipped cannot provide for the black market prices, and so he is forced into a never-ending rat race with no time or energy or resources for the simplest of health measures, adequate diet, and so on. Defining addiction legally as a disease, as has recently happened in New York State, is no solution, because this turns out to be a euphemism for locking him up, albeit in a hospital rather than in a jail, without any regard to the question of whether he can benefit from such treatment. Let me therefore stick my neck way out and declare flatly that if we can do nothing better for the addict, the least we can do for him is to provide him with quality-controlled drugs at inexpensive rates. And to compound my brashness, let me add that if there are suffering individuals who have not happened to meet up with narcotics, and if there is nothing better we can do for them, they too are as morally entitled to narcotics as is the terminal cancer case. Note the ifs in my statement. I am not advocating simply abandoning individuals to narcotics without even trying to give them something better. I would hope that these would be recourses of last resort, but they should be available as recourses of last resort until we can do something better. In the light of what I have just said, it is only a trivium to add that it should be a matter of individual diagnosis and experience with the individual patient whether to provide drugs in the course of a program of rehabilitation. No legislature, judge, district attorney, or police officer has any business or the competence to prescribe a line of treatment for a given patient, to say nothing of indiscriminately prescribing a line of treatment for all patients. Hence to the final premise, that given the fact of addiction, all other factors which distinguish one addict from another fade into insignificance. There are many facts, which time will not permit me to review, that point to the existence of different kinds of addicts. The etiologies of these different varieties of addiction are probably different, and the therapeutic considerations are undoubtedly different. I would also expect to find some personality differences between them. I have, for instance, not mentioned passive-dependent personalities as a common feature of addict personality organization, but that is because I think that dependency takes rather different forms in the various types of addiction. Apart from familiar diagnostic differences among addicts, such as schizoid versus psychopathic personalities, sex differences, socioeconomic differences, and various demographic differences, all of which are relevant, I think that the evidence points to four major varieties of narcotic addiction. But first, I must refer to certain concepts. There is the fact of craving. That is, a need for the drug. Please note that I am not using this word the way Dr. Linda Smith used it this morning. A need for the drug for its direct psychopharmacologic effects in the experience of the high and in the relief of anxiety, tension, and pain. Craving is basically independent of the state of physiological dependence. It is related to psychic tension. Many a hospitalized patient, for instance, long since detoxified, experiences no craving in the ordered routines of hospital life, but experiences intense cravings upon release. There is the fact of personal involvement in the activities of procuring drugs, in the personal relationships, in the rituals of taking narcotics, and so on. My notion of involvement is obviously related to Wickler's notion of hustling as a secondary reinforcer, and to Linda Smith's notion of personal identification with the addict subculture. I may be misinterpreting now. But there are also differences that I do not have time to discuss. I think of the role of personal involvement in connection with narcotics as an effort to fill a void, to find a place for oneself in the world, and to find something to which one can experience some sense of commitment. Finally, I want to point to the fact that under existing conditions, the taking of narcotics offers another form of being delinquent, of thumbing one's nose at the respectable elements of society, of expressing to the world at large a two-word epithet, the first word of which is a four-letter word from the Anglo-Saxon. Now to my four types of addicts. 1. There are addicts strongly influenced by craving, but with relatively little personal involvement. That is, their addiction is rooted in the direct psychopharmacological effects of the drug and their need for these effects. 2, there are addicts strongly influenced by personal involvement, but with relatively little craving. That is, they have no strong need for the direct psychopharmacological effects of the drug and are, for instance, little affected by the tolerance that they develop. 3, there are addicts with both strong cravings and personal involvement. And 4, there are addicts with neither strong craving nor personal involvement. Individuals with frequently repeated histories of dependency. This group includes individuals who are simply unable to resist the pressures of their immediate environment, but in the main, I think it is made up of nose-thumbers at society. And of course, there are the non-addict users, from those who take an occasional fling to the weekend party users who rarely, if ever, develop any high degree of physiological dependency. Note that the simple fact of occasional dependency, with long intervals between occasions, is not to me sufficient to define an addict. In fact, I only think of the first and third types as true addicts. That is, to me, craving is an essential characteristic of true addiction. To this, I must add that available evidence indicates that the majority of addicts are not true addicts. That is, most addicts are of the second and fourth types. Now I ask you, does it look as though the law can define a treatment policy for all addicts? I think that the answer is unequivocally that the law should get out of the business of treating addiction, and that those who are competent to do so be allowed and given the needed resources to get to work in the diagnosis and treatment of addicts without hindrance, qualifications, and restrictions other than those contained in existing codes of professional ethics.
We have three discussants who have been asked to prepare discussions of papers.
Dr. Walter C. Bailey of the UCLA School of Social Welfare wished to comment on Dr. Chine's paper, so I'll ask him to comment first.
Commenting on Dr. Chine's excellent paper, they were all three very fine papers, but responding primarily to Dr. Chine's for at least a couple of reasons. One is a matter of time, and also is my feeling that a couple of things I have to say also may apply to Dr. Friedman and Dr. Wickler's paper. I enjoyed this paper very much. For one thing, he was saying some things about the nature of drug addiction and the ways we've been handling this problem that I've been saying for quite some time without winning any particular popularity contest. And I'm pleased to see the premises underlying our public policy laid bare and substantially refuted. I'm in full agreement with his thesis that the most important task in treating drug addicts is not to get them to stop taking drugs. Our emphasis on a so-called drug-free life is a product of a sort of peculiar aspect of our Puritan heritage, and probably, I sometimes think, has something to do with the Fu Manchu myth. Now, just a couple of comments about a specific issue, and that is, despite the fact that, and in a sense, I apply this to all three papers, I think, but despite the fact that Dr. Chine did specify craving, for example, as an essential aspect of what he calls true drug addiction, I still had the feeling that there was really no systematic definition of what drug addiction is. Now, this is an old cliche with us, of course, that we should define our terms. And not only that, but define them systematically and as rigorously as possible within some kind of a conceptual framework. And I'd just like to take a couple of examples from Dr. Chine. He noted that after 1919, when the Harrison Act became enforceable, that although there were many thousands of addicts in this country who had had free access to narcotics, and I quote, "There does not seem to have been a tremendous wave of withdrawal sickness nor any tremendous upsurge in the number of robberies of pharmacies and physicians' offices as desperate addicts attempted to replenish their supplies. Instead, the number of addicts was peacefully and quietly reduced and left to less than half of the original number." Secondly, and I quote, he says, and I love this, "My mind simply boggles at the thought of active addicts who are no longer using drugs." And mine does too. And thirdly, he said the important task is to help them to solve their problems, and that they take narcotics is, per se, the least of these. Again, I thought a wonderful way of putting an obvious point. But when you put these three together, there's some contradiction, obviously. Thousands of addicts in 1919 must have gone into spontaneous remissions. And secondly, this is difficult to accept because, as I say, my mind also boggles at the thought of addicts not using drugs. If, however, 50% of a large number of addicts are capable of voluntary remission, then it seems to me that one would expect much more effective results from our various treatment and correctional programs. Now, I just am pointing this out, and I will leave the issue, because I think this is an example of our failure to really define systematically the term drug addiction. And I would say, obviously, that these people in 1919, these 50% sites, these obviously these were people who would not be called drug addicts. They were not true addicts. I, of course, espouse Dr. Linda Smith's definition, which I won't refer to because I'm sure you've had it. So I just want to close by saying then that, reiterating that the way we have and continue to treat drug addicts, and I agree with Dr. Chine, or even more so, because I think it's criminal as well as irrational. But more and more serious students of the problem, people of stature, are coming around to this point of view, and they're reaching the same conclusion. And it seems to me that the handwriting is on the wall, and this kind of irrationality cannot go on forever. Thank you.
Mr. Harold B. Bradley is Associate Superintendent of the California Rehabilitation Center at Corona, California. Mr. Bradley?
In terms of time, I'm going to try to respond here more or less broadside rather than to one paper or another, although because of the recency of Dr. Chine's paper, I think perhaps I'll be talking more to some of his ideas towards the end of his paper. I'm not quite sure, Dr. Chine, whether I qualify within your term of definition of the people who should get out of the business or not. I represent an institution which is the mid-product or the midpoint in a rather long chain of legal commitment, confinement within an institution, and supervised aftercare in the community. But I've been listening through the three papers today for a word that has a great deal of importance to me and to us in the Rehabilitation Center, and that's the word control. I've heard it used 2 or 3 times, but not really in the context within which it has a great deal of importance to us. It seems to me that pragmatically defining the term of addict for the population with which we are dealing, it really doesn't matter whether the addiction is a product of problems or problems are a product of addiction. I think the basic core of the notion that I'm looking for here is that addiction as we are dealing with it, addicts or people who use and abuse narcotic substances that we deal with, seem to be basically people who are to one degree or another not in control of themselves. And as a consequence, it seems rational to me that the need to apply controls from outside is a necessary and fundamental first step. So I, within my frame of reference, can't agree with Dr. Chine's point that the goal of getting the addict to stop using narcotics is not an appropriate goal, and I know I'm overstating your point, but it seems to me it's a very appropriate first goal, because the people that we are dealing with, the kind of addiction pattern that we are dealing with, the vast amount of the life energy of the individual goes into narcotics acquisitory behavior, and precious little life energy is left over to cope with the problems that either are precedents or antecedents of the narcotics use. It seems to me that it's quite necessary to apply these controls in order that the person's narcotics acquisitory behavior can be reduced to a minimum or completely eliminated perhaps, and allow them to use whatever internal energies and strengths they have to deal with these problems that came before or after or along with the narcotics addiction. One point that I was interested in hearing more about from Dr. Wickler's paper. My first review of this paper, I thought, well, gee, this has no application for me, and the second time around, I thought, well, maybe it does, and when I heard you here today, I felt it did have a lot of application. I would like to know if, freely translating your work into rather broad terms in man, if we might not consider the program of Nalene management of what I would call them post-addicts in the community after a period of time in an institution under a social treatment regime, if we might not consider this the negative conditioning element that you were talking about in terms of conditioning away your theoretically derived or your notion of conditioning to the acquisitive behavior as well as conditioning to the withdrawal behavior. If I understood you correctly, conditioning to the withdrawal behavior or countering that conditioning, institutional treatment of a more traditional variety would be appropriate. It would seem to me that the element of the Nalene management in the community in a drug-available environment might represent in man this factor that you were trying to condition out as far as your experiment was concerned.
We'll return to I can't resist stating a wonder that I have. I wonder why no one has suggested incarcerating all alcohol addicts and all persons who are, by repeated use, in imminent danger of becoming addicted to alcohol. I think if we started to do that, we would discover some other obstacles in this program that don't loom very large at present.
Incarcerate these two.
And cigarette fiends. I'd like to call on Dr. John Clausen.
I'd like first of all to express my delight with these 3 papers which gave us the clinical approach to research, a comparative experimental report of a comparative experimental study, and an epidemiological study. The 2 that dealt with addicts did something that I think might not have been done 15 years ago, perhaps couldn't have been done in any such meeting without fear that one's reputation would seriously suffer. Challenge some of the assumptions that have that at least 15 years ago were so completely held that they simply weren't subject to challenging. Now, it's true that they have been challenged increasingly in the last few years, and I think this is all to the good. One might have thought that we in the United States were simply incapable of learning from experience by virtue of the fact that failure after failure in dealing with our traditional treatment of drug addicts in a drug-free environment did not seem to lead anyone seriously to question the assumption that you had to have a drug-free environment, that it had to be achieved by incarceration in order to do anything with drug addiction. It may be that there are many, many problems that haven't been solved. Quite clearly, this is the case. But also quite clearly, we begin now to look, as Dr. Friedman is looking, at other possibilities, recognizing there's not going to be outstanding success immediately, but that perhaps we have a great deal to learn by such experimentation. I was impressed with the fact that both Dr. Chine and Dr. Friedman seem to agree that detoxification is just a first step, or perhaps, as Dr. Friedman said, not even the first step. There has to be a good deal of preparation for this if it's to mean anything. Yet it's a step for which there must be very careful consideration as to the meaning for the individual. I have been intrigued by the several references to cigarette smoking and to the question of addiction. Several people have mentioned that addiction is a disease. It's also been mentioned that it is taken as a symbol of moral degradation, perhaps more than any other behavior in the United States in the last, shall we say, 30 to 40 years it has been such a symbol. Let's take cigarette smoking, which before 1900 was not looked upon with any great favor. Increasingly, it appears that it is decidedly harmful. There's some reluctance to call it an addiction, since physiological dependency does not occur to the same extent, at least. I wondered, though, how many people who have a 2-pack-a-day habit or more have been able to kick that habit and keep it kicked. It seems to me that it might be worth studying the craving for cigarettes and the consequences of trying to deal, the alternative ways of trying to deal with this particular habit. I do use the term habit. I'm not quite willing to say cigarette smoking is a disease. And yet, I'm not so sure that we can use the term disease directly and unequivocally in talking about drug addiction, and withhold its use unequivocally in talking about addictive smoking. The whole problem of mental disorder, whether it is disease in the same sense as physical disorder, has received a good deal of attention in the last few years. We have books like Zsa's The Myth of Mental Illness. Zsa's and others are increasingly questioning whether the behaviors that are symptoms of human difficulties in adjustment should be called disease in the same sense that physical diseases are labeled. Let me turn for a moment to Dr. Chine's paper. I have tremendous admiration for the scope of his research and for his forthright statement of his convictions. I'm a little bit puzzled by one of his findings. He suggests that drug use in New York City is found most sharply or very largely in deprived population groups. He also suggests that practically all addicts show substantial personality pathology. He acknowledges that such pathology is not limited to the addict group. And he looked for an intervening variable, which he felt he found in family structure and functioning. I'm puzzled by the fact that he found no overlap, because if we find that there are many non-users in deprived population groups, but we find there is a high incidence of other forms of pathology, it's not quite clear to me why the addicts should come just from one type of family setting. Suppose there were no drugs available in the area. What would happen to these subjects? Does one not find similar cases of family pathology in areas of the city in which drugs are not readily available? What happens there? If Dr. Chine could tell us a bit more about some of the differentials in family background, I think this would be very helpful in terms of the implications that this might have for treatment. Let me end on, let me say a word about Dr. Wickler's very beautiful experiment. It seemed to me that this illustrated the derivation of an experimental technique from theoretical considerations and a magnificent job of execution, carrying out all of the steps that were needed, the requirement of a different kind of narcotic substance than had been available before. The design in order to reinforce the behavior of the addicted animals. Now, it seems to me that it demonstrates the plausibility, very definitely demonstrates the plausibility of his two-factor learning theory. We all recognize that it's a long ways from rats to man, and perhaps particularly because man is capable of symbolic behavior. By virtue of language, he can internalize the processes going on around him. It occurred to me that in some ways Dr. Wickler had perhaps not entirely adequately dealt with this aspect of the difference between humans and rats in talking about getting away from mentalistic approaches. We can't ignore, for example, the fact that we form an image of the nature of drug processes and a stereotype of addiction in ways other than being directly involved in addiction. We don't have to experience directly because through symbolic processes we can learn a good deal about the nature of drugs and people's feelings about them. It seems to me that his formulations on conditioning might very well apply especially to the long-term heavily addicted person. He quoted Cobb's statement, the person who over a period of years relieves his distress thousands of times. This theory would seem to me less adequate to explain the relapse rate of the younger addict, a relapse rate that seems to be no less high. Finally, I would question whether, if the effects are not due to hyperirritability, I would question whether the extinction of the conditioned response in man could be achieved in the same manner as extinction might be achieved in a non-language using animal.
Thank you. Two of the speakers have questions which they will remember, but I would like to ask the audience whether there are questions from the audience. If you have a question which you would like to address to one of the speakers, rise, identify yourself, and state your question. The lady objects to the fact that female addicts have not been mentioned, she says, all day. I don't think this calls for an answer, does it? We just forgot about it.
No, I don't.
They're there. We're gentlemen.
I don't think that's fair.
Says.
Lindy, I mentioned that the people in 1919 Dr. Chine were talking about, it's been said, were largely composed of very nice, rather elderly ladies who were hooked on various kinds of nerve tonics, et cetera, et cetera. But
In the adolescent and younger population in New York, they run about 1/6 of the number of males. The basic reason why I have little to say about them is that I very little studied them. We did do one small study of the female addict, and the indications are that they're not terribly different from the male. But it wasn't that I overlooked the female. I'll never overlook the female. The problem seemed more acute than the males, and so we studied it there.
I'd like to direct a question to Dr. Chane. He said at the beginning of his paper and at the end of the paper two things that I'd like him to clarify. In 1914 and 1919, when drugs were readily available for the addicts,
The question is about the alleged reduction in the number of addicts when the Harrison Act was passed in relation to some proposed change in present policy. You understand the question? Okay.
Should I speak to all of these, or?
We'll speak to, I thought you'd speak to this gentleman's question.
Oh. I can't see any reason why it should. First of all, my image of what transpired back around the period of the enactment of the Harrison Act, first of all, it's not quite true to say that it was not enforced until 1919. There were aspects of the Harrison Act that had to do with the control and distribution of the legitimate trade, like, for instance, the inclusion of narcotics in proprietary medications. My image of what happened here was that an awful lot of women, for instance, who were taking their Lydia E. Pinkham's compound or whatever it was, and it seemed to be fine, helpful. Then came a point where it stopped being fine and helpful. They now began to have withdrawal reactions, which they interpreted as the reasons why they were taking the stuff in the first place. Eventually, they got over these withdrawal reactions, and now the compound had a very fine placebo effect. It satisfied all the involvement needs, and they were busy doing things. As to the question of whether making narcotics available to addicts would have the consequence of increasing the number of addicts, I have yet to hear a rational reason for developing such an expectation. As it's rooted in the notion that if anything, well, let me put it this way, anything that we do to make it easier for the addict to get along in the open environment is going to affect others, because addiction is contagious. Well, addiction isn't contagious in any such sense. And suppose you give some guy enough medication to last him until his next visit to the office, and the medication is a narcotic. Okay, he wants to look like a big shot. So he goes and offers it to somebody else. Well, this is another part of the image of becoming an addict. You once take the stuff and you're finished. The fact of the matter is that most people do not become addicted, and certainly don't even become dependent on such an occasion. Well, pretty soon he discovers he hasn't got enough. He's got some explanation to make as to what he's been doing with this stuff. He's not out to missionize. I have encountered this with regard to marijuana. There was one character around New York who developed a religious faith around marijuana. And so he was out to convert the rest of the world to his religious faith, part of which involved taking marijuana. I have encountered this, not directly, but by hearsay, in connection with psilocybin and possibly, what's that drug?
LSD.
LSD, lysergic acid, on the part of a couple of people who seem to have they don't identify this as a religion, but there's a sort of a simple religious faith built about it, and so one gathers that they go around trying to persuade, if rumors are correct, to persuade the rest of the world to share this marvelous experience. With mescaline, one encounters this occasionally. But by and large, the the addict isn't a guy who's got the energy level, the concern, the relationship to other people, the nature of his relation to the drugs is not of such a character that would lead one to believe that he would take these drugs, which are being given to him at a relatively inexpensive price, to go out and recruit other users. The basic fact is that if he does now get involved in recruiting other users, he's doing so not because he wants to spread addiction. He's doing so because he wants to provide himself with the wherewithal to continue his own. Take that reason away from him, and I see no reason why he should continue. Even here, in one of our studies of drug use in juvenile street gangs, there was a kind of a very interesting phenomenon, and that is that the pushers in high-use gangs, in drug-using gangs, would lay off their fellow gang members who just come back from Riverside or from Lexington. The notion was, this isn't a good thing. As they would try to discourage these highly vulnerable individuals who had just come back, they would do their selling to the other gangs.
I would like to make a comment about the Cobb-Dumez article. This was published in 1924, and the figure of 200,000 was used. Cobb and Dumez based their estimates on the imports of legal narcotics, which they divided at the rate of 6 grain per day, and they got a figure of 200,000 if all legitimately imported supplies were used by addicts, without deducting for the necessary medical use. They further made the assumption, when they deducted for proper medical use, they got a figure close to 100,000, 110,000, something like that. I've forgotten it exactly. They made the further assumption that after 1915, smuggled narcotics played no role in the trend in addiction in this country. If one reads the fine print, one finds these statements. Consequently, they had to find a declining rate of addiction after 1914 because only drugs were imported only for legitimate, so-called legitimate medical uses. I think we might ask the two members, the two speakers who had questions addressed to them by discussants. Dr. Wickler, do you have something to say about the...
Well, to answer Dr. Clausen's questions first, I might say, as far as the higher symbolic processes to which Dr. Clausen refers, it's quite obvious that man is distinguished from a rat in that respect. But one may question how often he uses these higher symbolic processes. And I think we have tended to underestimate the degree to which men are capable of being rats under certain conditions. Also, we don't have the tools to deal with these higher symbolic processes right now. Someday I hope we will. We can talk about these higher symbolic processes in mentalistic terms, but these aren't tools. They're metaphors and tautologies. This doesn't mean that we cannot develop tools to deal with these processes. The physicists began with very simple tools in their work, and today they're so complex that a non-physicist can't understand them, but the physicist has not reverted to mentalistic cosmogonies. And I don't think we should do that either. We should exert our energies to developing tools for dealing with these higher symbolic processes so that the operations by which we define these processes and manipulate them are public and not private. Until we have those tools, I can't say anything about their relative importance in the genesis of addiction or anything else. I know that we have plenty to do with these lower order phenomena which are common to the rat and also to man. Now, I'm not quite sure what he said about the question he asked about hyperirritability. Were you questioning the persistence of hyperirritability after withdrawal or affirming it?
No, it seemed to me that you had indicated that there were two alternatives, and if the effects that you found are not due to hyperirritability, then, as I understand it, you propose that we'll have to work at an extinction.
Yeah.
And my question, I should say that it seems to me that you have nicely demonstrated conditioning, which I would presume to be as effective in man as in the rats. My question really applies to the extinction.
Yes.
It's there that I would feel that the use of language makes a peculiar problem.
Yes. I would agree on this specific point. The extinction example I gave was merely for purposes of illustration. In other words, if we were to follow the same extinction paradigm in man as we do in rat experiments, this is what we would do, or what I told you about this morning. It doesn't follow that it would necessarily have to take that form. Here, language does become both an aid and an obstacle. Psychotherapy, you might say, if it's directed with the aim of accomplishing extinction in mind, could be a very useful tool. But I doubt if any psychotherapist treating an addict has ever been aware of what it is that he's trying to accomplish, what it is that he's trying to extinguish, because he has never thought in those terms. Instead, they have group session psychotherapies where they talk about drugs incessantly, which is the most wonderful secondary reinforcement you can possibly imagine. And this is one thing I should think should not be done. So that I think it's possible to utilize psychotherapy with verbal tools, if you wish, provided that the psychotherapy is designed and guided to accomplish extinction and not to foster it, not to do the reverse, to reinforce the behavior under treatment. Now, as far as the hyperirritability is concerned, I stated that there are two possible alternative explanations of the data, or much more likely, a combination. That is to say, both factors operate. And this, I think, the extent to which both factors operate can certainly be answered by further research. Now, this leads to the question that Dr. Bradley asked about the Nalene Mounds and post-addicts in California. Well, I think Dr. Bradley may know that I had something to do with the discovery of the abstinence-precipitating properties of Nalene, and but I didn't dream at that time that it would ever be used to catch addicts. I think there are better ways to catch addicts, and simpler ways too. For example, chemical tests on the urine. Now, leaving that aside, however, the detective, or I should say detection procedure can be used as a form of avoidance conditioning. It could be used as the aversive stimulus in development of an avoidance response. But this does not extinguish the basic process which I was talking about this morning. In other words, there's no reason to believe that such avoidance conditioning, such negative conditioning through avoidance training will persist after the avoidance training is discontinued. How long are you going to keep these post-addicts on the Nalene, on unpredicted and unannounced Nalene tests? a year, 2 years, 10 years, a lifetime. Theoretically, it should be continued a lifetime, because such avoidance training does not in any way affect the reinforced drug acquisitory behavior. It merely conflicts with it, and you might say suppresses it. I think a much more fundamental approach would be the true extinction procedure, which I discussed this morning and to which I made some reference in my answer to Dr. Clausen.